wanted to kind of go back and, look at your history as being somebody, a freedom fighter, social justice worker. It seems like you and Ms. Sotomayor might be within years of each other, so coming up around the same time. But, what we have now that seems to be coming before these courts are problems that stem back 30, 40 years when folks like yourselves were out on these streets demanding justice. We just had the court ruling for the SF-8. But there are a lot of folks that were Brown Berets and Black Panthers and what have you that find themselves either in jail, still fighting cases after all these times, or dealing with issues, whether it's police brutality on down to some of the issues that you're working with now, that is still problematic. My first question is, from your early days as being, in the struggle, was that something that was on the agenda or a goal to one day have people of color, in this case a brown face, in some of these high places with the expectation that they would, see things from the perspectives of folks like yourselves?
Well, it's always been our issue to look across the board, whether it's education, whether it's the judicial system, to look at fairness and to look at justice. And whenever you talk about fairness and justice, then you have to look at who lives in this particular society. And it's all people. It's not just, it's just not white. It's not just African American. It's just not indigenous, Native American, Latino, Asian. It's across the spectrum. And so we have got to have that representation. And so we've always worked in our struggle to make sure that there's a diversity, but more that there's an understanding. And I think a consciousness, and I think that that's what we're talking about, is a consciousness when we talk about Sotomayor, is that she has a consciousness. You can't go through all these different struggles and experiences without having a certain consciousness. And I think that that's what we're really looking for, is a consciousness of how the consciousness of the law is interpreted.
What would be some of the issues that you would hope she would be able to rule on if these go to the courts? What are some of the current battles that you have that you're engaged with right now that may one day find itself at the feet of the Supreme Court?
Well, I think one of the big issues is the issues of environmental justice. It's sort of like that's been tossed and turned about, when you live around all these polluting facilities, can you prove, this whole thing of proof that they're actually contaminating you, that they're actually that the burden is usually on the individual, when the burden should be on the corporation to prove that they're not poisoning you. I think that those issues, when we look at air quality and water quality, those are real big issues. One of the things that I like to see also come back is that whole issue of people with criminal background not being able to live in public housing, not being able to rent in any kind of housing that receives federal grants and money. I think that was a big disappointment and something that I think that was misinterpreted by the Supreme Court, and that definitely is something that I think that the Supreme Court with Mrs. Sotomayor looking at these particular issues, because those things have really impacted our community negative. The whole issue of the criminalization of our youth and our people, these long-term sentences for non-violent issues, the whole issue about trying to find employment, also besides the housing. Those are all very important issues in our community.
What about the recent situation in Houston where they now have the cops acting as ICE agents, and you're now starting to see this crackdown with local agencies now being federalized or deputized to look for undocumented people, which means that there's a disproportionate amount of law enforcement now coming to brown communities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the federal law needs to look at who's crossing jurisdictions and who has the rights and who doesn't have the rights, and to be looking at human rights. And I think that that's been a big failure, because in the United States we only talk about civil rights and we don't look at human rights, and that human rights takes us to an ultimate level. And I think that that is something that the Supreme Court should be really looking at, as the violation of human rights, what would take us to a higher standard.
What's the difference for people who don't know, civil versus human rights? Because that's the struggle that Malcolm X was talking about.
Well, when you look at different countries and you look when police beat up people and they incarcerate them without giving them a rights, That's really a human rights violation when you've been beaten and oppressed and not given your rights. But here in the United States, it's not looked at, it's not documented as a human rights violation. It's actually looked at as a civil rights violation. So you will never see in our courts a violation of human rights like you will see in other countries, because the United States has renamed what is a human rights violation, and they don't have human rights violation. They only have civil rights violation. And after those civil rights violations turn out to be human rights violations.